Αλεξάνδερ Τζέικοπ κατέχει εις βάθος αυτά τα θέματα, έχοντας το μοναδικό πλεονέκτημα της διπλής οπτικής, διότι διαθέτει αφενός ένα στέρεο ακαδημαϊκό υπόβαθρο ως εκ των σπουδών του, έχει περατώσει ένα κύκλο σπουδών επίπεδο μάστερ στην Βρετανία, αργότερα ακολούθησε διδακτορικές σπουδές, τελείωσε το διδακτορικό του στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Πενσιλβάνια, τον ΗΠΑ, και είχε μεταδιδακτορικές σπουδές στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Τορόντο, όπου και έχει διδάξει ως επισκέπτης καθηγητής. Ταυτόχρονα όμως είναι και ένας πολυγραφότατος συγγραφέας με σειρά βιβλίων που όλα τους εστιάζουν στην ευρωπαϊκή παράδοση. Αλλά όπως είπα, έχει το πλεονέκτημα αυτής της διπλής οπτικής, γιατί αφενός έχει ακαδημαϊκά περαιτέρω σπουδές σε δυτικά πανεπιστήμια, αφετέρου όμως, ως εκ της οικογενειακής του καταγωγής και ανατροφής του στην Ινδία, είναι βαθύς γνώστης και βιωματικός της παραδοσιακής σοφίας της Ανατολής και είναι ασφαλώς εξοικειωμένος με την Ινδουιστική και βραχμανική παράδοση. Μπορεί λοιπόν να συνθέτει και να εναρμονίζει αυτές τις δύο παραδόσεις, την δυτική και την ανατολική, που αμφότερες βέβαια αρδεύονται από τις ίδιες πηγές της αρχαιγόνου σοφίας των Αρίων. Μετά την διάλεξη του Dr. Jacobs θα σας μιλήσει ο ηγέτης του ΑΡΜΑτος, ο Στεφάνος Γκέκας, ο οποίος, όπως γνωρίζετε, έχει πλέον επιστρέψει στην Ελλάδα μετά από χρόνια διαμονής στον Ευρωπαϊκό Βορρά. Θα σχολιάσει και θα εμβαθύνει σημεία της διαλέξεως και θα ακολουθήσει βέβαια συζήτηση με το κοινό για να κλείσουμε την εκδήλωση. Να σημειώσω σε αυτό το σημείο ότι το τελευταίο βιβλίο που αποτελεί την αφόρμηση για την σημερινή εκδήλωση πρόσφατα έχει εκδοθεί και έχει μεταφραστεί στα δανεικά και το εισαγωγικό σημείωμα το έχει γράψει ο Στεφάνος Γκέκας. Καλό λοιπόν στο βήμα, μάλλον δίνω το λόγο στον συγκεκριμένο μας ομιλητή για να μας μιλήσει με θέμα αριστοκρατία, φασισμός και το τέλος της αμερικανικής ιστορίας. Mr. Jacob.
Well, I'm very pleased to be back in Greece. I spoke in Thessaloniki about 15 years ago, and so I'm glad to be in Athens now. My talk is rather long. I hope it will not test your patience, and it's rather like a review of the history of philosophy. So,
let me just say, λέει ότι χαίρεται πολύ που είναι ξανά στην Αθήνα και περίπου μετά από 15 χρόνια από την τελευταία του επίσκεψη στην Ελλάδα, που ήταν εν σχέση προς την υφημών του ΑΡΜΑτος, δηλαδή σε πρόσκλησή του, και είπε ότι ο λόγος του είναι μάλλον μακρύς, γι' αυτό και επιλέξαμε να έχουμε διαφάνειες με την μετάφραση, παρά να έχουμε παράλληλη μετάφραση, η οποία θα υπερδιπλασίαζε τον χρόνο και θα κάνει ουσιαστικά μια αναδρομή στην ιστορία της φιλοσοφίας.
Okay. So you may know that Francis Fukuyama, the Japanese-American intellectual spokesman for the Jewish-American neoconservative movement, proclaimed in his 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, that liberal democracy was the final socio-political form, since earlier alternatives such as fascism and communism had proven to be ideological failures, and liberty and equality had now been established as universal norms. Fukuyama's view of history moving in progressive political phases was of course first popularized in the 19th century by German thinkers like Hegel and Karl Marx and their followers, who sought to discern historiographical patterns in the vagaries of military and economic fortune and to either celebrate or revolt against the current political status of their own nation, in their case Germany. To be sure, Hegel was somewhat more elevated than Marx in supposing the course of history to be the varying manifestations of a developing Weltgeist, or world spirit, whereas Marx's materialistic historiography was ruled by mere economic alterations. Nevertheless, the falsehood of the Hegelian Marxist philosophy of history is made clear to anyone who considers the history of the country America, which is promoting liberal democracy now as a universal norm, when in fact aristocratic forms of government have for millennia constituted the political tradition of the old world. From its inception as an independent nation, in America there has hardly been any deviation from liberal democratic goals, and communism and fascism have not only been absent there in their European forms, but if ever they emerge, they are quickly absorbed into the nation's unchanging liberal democratic framework. What American society actually represents is a sort of ahistorical, quasi-communist utopia, where private individuals strive ever most strenuously to possess the means of production and to resist the interference of the state in public affairs. There is also little to distinguish the communist ideal of equality from the liberal. When Fukuyama suggests that we have come to the end of history, what he therefore means is that the world that has undergone genuine historical changes has now been conquered by a country that began and continues as a utopia that is as little capable of historical change as of real progress. That is, progress understood not in the technological but in the traditional sense of the development of the spiritual, intellectual and social attitudes of a people. The end of history is indeed a phenomenon that is peculiar to America as a British colony that has had tenuous connections with the naturally developing history of the old world. While most countries founded by colonial settlement managed to maintain and develop the culture of their mother nation to a certain extent, as Australia, for example, has done, America began and developed at a time of Protestant and Puritan revolt against the ancient Catholic monarchical traditions of Britain. It is therefore important to consider the phenomenon of Puritanism, which provoked the English Civil War at the time that America was being settled, and to notice the close connection between Christian Puritanism and Judaism. We may recall in this context that the Jews who had been officially expelled from England in 1290 by Edward I were allowed by the Puritan dictator Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s to return from Holland, where they had been conducting a flourishing financial business. Throughout the Commonwealth, the Jews were held in high esteem by the Puritans. The similarity of the capitalist ethics developed by the Puritans to that of the Jews was noted in 1911 by the German sociologist Werner Sombart in his work Die Juden und das Wirtschaftsleben. Sombart maintained that the Protestant ethic that Max Weber had focused on in his 1905 work on the Protestant ethic was indeed to be identified specifically as a Puritan one that should be equated with Judaism. With the American Civil War of 1861 to 65, the last links with monarchical England that had persisted in the pro-English South were cut by the victory of the Federalist North. Then, in the aftermath of the Civil War, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Christian religious aspect of the original Puritan work ethic of the Americans was seriously impaired by the large-scale influx of Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, who succeeded in modulating the philo-Semitic Puritan character of American capitalism into a fully Jewish one. As Sombart pointed out, the Jews had indeed been active in American economic life already from the 17th century and had gradually come to monopolize many branches of American commerce, such as the wheat, tobacco and cotton trades. But we must note that with the increased immigration of Eastern Jews at the end of the 19th century and the promotion of Jewish finance capitalism, what remained of the original Puritan work ethic and concomitant frugality in the American economy was soon dissipated, while the only vestige of the dissident puritanical religiosity that survived was its stubborn anti-clericalism. With the replacement of the Puritan veneration of industry by the parasitical reign of finance, the Jewish tendency for economic utopianism, which manifested itself in the 20th century as totalitarian communism in Russia, Eastern Europe and the Far East, was transformed in the new promised land of the Jews into the totalitarian liberalism of the American dream. As Lombard put it, what we call Americanism is nothing else, if we may say so, than the Jewish spirit distilled. The capitalism promoted by the Jews steadily strengthened the nation's commitment to individualistic freedom and material aggrandizement, rather than to the civilizational aims of the old monarchies and empires. Naturally, such a nation could not evolve or acquire a human history. Instead of producing examples of human greatness, it could only boast of a bourgeoisie that aspired to millionaire status, and instead of historical development, it could only experience periodic economic booms and recessions. In his book, Fukuyama himself attempts to introduce a Nietzschean question into his glorification of liberal democracy by raising the spectre of the last man, or the average American-like man, whose life is materially sated and spiritually meaningless. But with naive optimism, he maintains that such an intolerably vacuous life will certainly be held at bay in liberal democracy by man's spiritedness, a human characteristic that will inevitably rebel against such a monotonous existence. This spiritedness is the same as what Plato called the middle part of the tripartite soul, between its rational and animal parts. In the liberal democratic system, as Fukuyama's view, instead of this passionate energy's reappearance in violent strife, as in the case of nationalist or imperialistic states, there will be an absorption of it into sports, business and political shows, such as election campaigns. Fukuyama's belief in the sort of social engineering that liberal democracy universally aims at ignores the vast difference between the states of the old world and the American. Indeed, the neoconservative enterprise propagated by Fukuyama serves as a timely reminder of the incompatibility of the American with the genuinely European systems of political thought. The American social values that are being imposed on Europe and the rest of the world via economic and military means are essentially alien ones and are neither likely to take root easily nor endure. This is because, unlike the American nation, European and other older nations have a historical vitality that cannot be suffocated by American avarice. In order to illustrate this fact, I shall survey the characteristic political traditions of the Indo-Europeans and the contradictory intellectual movements that have distorted these traditions in the course of modern history. To understand the traditional Indo-European social ethos, I may begin with the paradigmatic Aryan conception of society discernible in ancient India. The famous caste system of the Indians is, unlike the modern Western class system, an entirely spiritual one, and men are recognized not by their economic status, but by their hereditary spiritual capacity. The four Indian social orders are represented symbolically as the head, arms, thighs, and feet of the primordial cosmic anthropomorphic form of the divine soul called Purusha, or man, Adam. The manifestation of the soul itself is understood to occur as a result of its three inherent energies, sattva, rajas, and tamas, the first representing pure existence, the second motion, and the third inertia. Since there is an intimate and unavoidable correspondence between the macrocosm and the human microcosm, these three energies appear embodied in differing degrees among humans as well. The sattvic element most fully manifests itself in the Brahmins, the rajasic in the warriors or kshatriyas, and the tamasic and the Vaisyas and the Shudras, particularly the latter. This is the original spiritual and psychological basis of all social hierarchy. The Brahman owes his preeminent position in society to his superhuman spiritual power. Brahman, the deity who represents the intellectual light of the cosmos, itself derives from a word denoting creative power. And it is the privilege and duty of the Brahman to represent this creative power. The Kshatriyas, or political rulers and warriors, only serve to maintain this creative power, both within the land and also in the universe. The Brahman and the Kshatriya thus constitute the paradigmatic Indo-European polity, centered on the dual organs of what in European politics are called church and state. The people, as such, do not have a major political role, either as a bourgeoisie or as a proletariat. If we turn to the Greek philosophers, we find that in Plato and Aristotle, the state is again constantly conceived of in terms of the constitution of the universal and individual soul. According to Plato, the soul is that which moves itself and is naturally prior to the body, since it is what governs all the changes and modifications of bodies. Just as in ancient India, the soul, or psyche, in Plato's Republic, is divided into three parts: a higher rational or spiritual part, corresponding to the Indian sattva, a middle passionate one, corresponding to rajas, and a lower sensual part, corresponding to tamas. Since society is as organic a phenomenon as the individuals of which it is composed, in a state as well as the more rational aspect predominates over the passionate, the closer it approximates to the ideal political form. But the discipline of the lower desires by the dictates of reason is to be found in only a few, and these are the best born and the best educated men, whereas the untrained and untamed passions are to be found in abundance among children, women, and the lower classes, which form the largest section of society. The aristocratic guardians of Plato's ideal republic are therefore required to be true philosophers and will not be drawn from the inferior classes. Aristotle continues Plato's spiritually oriented political philosophy in his Nicomachean Ethics, where he declares that the primary aim of politics is the attainment of the good of the nation. The higher classes of a nation will comprise the full citizens who will assume the military and administrative offices of the land. The legislators must govern with a clear knowledge of the spiritual constitution of man, that is, the rational and passionate elements that Plato had discerned in the individual soul. And it is the duty of the legislators to ensure the predominance of the higher aspect of the soul over the lower. Platonic principles reappear in the European Renaissance in the writings of aristocratic thinkers like Francesco Guicciardini and Jean Baudin. According to Guicciardini, who offered a critique of Machiavelli in one of his works, the chief reason that a prince and an aristocracy is superior to the people is that they are not subject to pernicious passions, such as notably envy. The French Renaissance philosopher Baudin, who is notable for his championing of monarchical absolutism, also based his defense of the latter on a similar Platonic basis. Genuine monarchy is, according to him, derived from the divine law, and the monarch is the earthly image of God. Care should be taken that the religious foundation of the state is never brought into doubt, and religious leaders must act as censors of the state in order to maintain moral discipline within it. It is at this juncture in world history that the revolutionary anti-monarchical ideas of the English Civil War, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution appear. If we study the American Bill of Rights of 1789, we realize that it was based largely on the English Bill of Rights of 1689, promulgated by the originally Puritan English Parliament after the glorious Protestant Revolution of 1688 in order to curb the powers traditionally invested in the formerly Catholic monarchs of England. And one of the most influential English thinkers of the 17th century, and one generally considered to be the father of liberal democracy, was John Locke, who was also a Puritan. Locke was a champion of the separation of the church and state and had a profound influence on the American founding fathers, such as Thomas Jefferson. The American Bill of Rights, based on the British parliamentarian one, is especially notable for its dissociation of the American state from any official religion. What had begun in England as a rejection of Catholicism was thus in America turned into a rejection of all official religion. Combined with this fear of theocracy was the puritanical devotion to individual freedom and industry, which caused the Americans to view citizenship as a status defined primarily by liberty and citizens as economic units of production, not unlike those of the later communist utopia of Marx. A little later, in the middle of the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau propagated the Lockean conception of government in France as a social contract directed by the volonté générale of the people, which would reduce the inequalities springing from subservience to the state. However, a robust answer to Rousseau's doctrine of the social contract was offered immediately after the fateful French Revolution by the English political philosopher Edmund Burke, where he pointed out that the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, calico or tobacco, or some such low concern. And since the people cannot be relied upon to follow any general will towards the attainment of the good of the nation, Burke proposed a natural aristocracy as the only visible national government. A strong nation is also necessarily a religious one, for as Burke said, all politicians indeed act on behalf of the one great master, author and founder of society, that is God. Religion's vital role in the conduct of states was reiterated in post-revolutionary France by the French monarchist Joseph de Maistre, as well, who noted in his essay that the duration of empires has always been proportionate to the degree of influence the religious element gained in the political constitution. Indeed, the truly political laws of a land are synonymous with the religious feelings of the people, and the instant man separates himself from God to act alone, he does not lose power, but his activity is negative and leads only to destruction. To follow the doctrines of Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau and Voltaire would thus result in a return to a state of anarchy and degeneracy. In Germany, around the same time, philosophers like Kant and Fichte were beginning to point to the crucial significance of the state as the means of enforcing an enlightened government. Kant took as his point of departure the excellence of divine law in relation to natural law, so that reason, or the moral law, was elevated far above the mindless workings of nature. To establish this rule of the moral law on earth, Kant proposed a supremely powerful state that would control all religious and commercial offices in the land. The leader of the state can never be a democratic representative of the people, since democracy inevitably results in despotism. While Kant favored a monarchical republic, Fichte advocated a Platonic philosopher-statesman who is at once a political and religious leader of his nation. Like a Platonic guardian, such a statesman, and I quote, in his estimate of mankind, looks beyond that which they are in the actual world to that which they are in the divine idea. The monarch will bear the responsibility for the realization of the inner freedom of the individuals within his nation. It is important to note in this context Fichte's emphasis that the aim of all society is, and I quote, ever-increasing ennoblement of the human race, that is, to set it more and more at liberty from the bondage of nature, just as the aim of all culture is to subject nature to reason. In order to counteract the spurious freedom that the young in particular hanker after, Fichte insists that a new system of education must be developed, which essentially destroys the freedom of will and produces, on the contrary, strict necessity in the decisions of the will. The state continues to be glorified in Hegel's idealistic philosophy. For Hegel, the state, and especially the Prussian state, is the embodiment of rational freedom, realizing and recognizing itself in an objective form. And in the Prussian nationalism of Heinrich von Treitschke, the state is glorified to an extent that it becomes a sort of substitute for God. Treitschke takes care to stress that the consciousness of national unity is dependent on a common bond of religion, for religious sentiment is one of the fundamental forces of the human character. Unfortunately, in his situation, the interference of Jewish elements in German politics had disturbed the traditional spiritual ordering of society by encouraging the coexistence of several religions within one nationality, involving an irreconcilable and ultimately intolerable difference of outlook upon life. Directly opposed to these several statist doctrines of the German idealists and nationalists is the doctrine of communism, which was propounded in the middle of the 19th century by the Jewish political economist Karl Marx. The radical difference between the Marxist view of the world and the Indo-European is already evident in the fact that Marx's system was based on a materialism that totally denied the existence of any spiritual reality whatsoever, and all metaphysics in general, in favor of a dialectical socio-economics that attempted to understand the transformations of society according to its changing modes of production. Unlike Hegel, who had justified history as the changing manifestations of a quasi-divine world spirit, Marx wished to create history by focusing on what he considered its essential economic activities. However, the communist system, for all its apparent evolutionary aspirations, is an anti-scientific, utopian construct aiming at an anti-human, classless and stateless society based on the common ownership of the means of production. In this delusional sociological experiment, Marx focused especially on class struggle, or the conflict between capital and labour, as the primary instrument of historical change. By granting economic, social and political equality to all citizens, Marx believed that the social awareness and discipline of every individual would naturally be increased. And while he tolerated the representative parliamentary political system as a transitional stage, his communist utopia aimed at a final dissolution of the state apparatus, which is what induces hierarchy and inequality at the most advanced state of communism, when the people will become fully self-governing. Marxism is thus the fullest expression of a liberal worldview that is diametrically opposed to the traditional or conservative Indo-European ordering of society according to spiritual character, which we have observed in ancient India, Greece, and the rest of Europe, until the advent of Puritanism in the middle of the 17th century. Marxism is naturally also opposed to the state structure that supports the religious and warrior aristocracy that founded, constitutes and preserves the nation. It may be noted here that although modern liberal democratic countries pretend to abhor the communist ideology, the arrogation of political powers in the West by the commercial middle class represents a major step towards the same dissolution of the concepts of national authority and sovereignty that communism too strives for. Marxist political economic theories were strongly criticized at the turn of the century by many notable German thinkers like Eugen Dühring and Oswald Spengler, But I should like to highlight here two of the most metaphysically structured political, philosophical responses to Marxism, namely the theories of the Italian fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentile and the pro-fascist thinker Julius Evola. According to Gentile, the basis of evil, exactly as in Plato and Plotinus, is matter or nature, which is opposed to spirit and represents, as it were, and I quote him, not merely moral and absolute nullity, but the impenetrable chaos of brute nature, mechanism, spiritual darkness, falsehood and evil, all the things that man is forever fighting against. Gentile points out that the economic life focused on by Marx is marked by a utilitarianism akin to the instinctual life of animals and is a life of slavery to matter, whereas politics should be a means to spiritual freedom. Indeed, Marxism aimed at the worst sort of social organization, the utilitarian, materialistic, and hence egoistic conception of life, understood as a realm of rights to be vindicated, instead of as an arena of duties to be performed by sacrificing oneself to an ideal. On the other hand, the fascist, Gentile was a fascist philosopher, understands life as being, and I quote, serious, austere, religious, entirely balanced in a world sustained by the moral and responsible forces of the spirit. The fascist disdains the easy life. Gentile's understanding of society is based on the Kantian ideal of a transcendent society, which is produced by the interaction of the ego and its pure object, the alter ego. It is this conception of a transcendent society which makes man a political animal, as Aristotle has suggested. The gradual self-realization of an individual necessarily entails the enlightenment of his objective counterparts, the other members of society, so that the nation as a whole begins to approach the ideal of a transcendent society. For Gentile, as for Fichte, the proper intellectual activity of the enlightened individual is the comprehension of the whole of mankind, or of the idea of mankind, and the state is the objective embodiment of the personality of the individuals constituting it, or the universal common aspect of their individual wills. As he explained in the introductory essay, Fundamental Ideas to Mussolini's Political and Social Doctrine of Fascism, booklets that Mussolini published, the state stands for the universal conscience and will of man in his historic existence. True political liberty is therefore possible only when the individuals that constitute the state become free through the realization of the universal aspect of their personality. The state, in its universal aspect, is an image of the divine will, and the laws of the state must ever be in consonance with the divine law. Religion, naturally, is not an external aid to the will of the state. It is its constitutive element. As explained in Fundamental Ideas, fascism is a religious conception in which man is considered to be in the powerful grip of a superior law, with an objective will which transcends the particular individual and elevates him into a fully conscious member of a spiritual society. The prime task of the state is to foster the ideal development of individuals and of the society. As he put it, the fascist state reassumes all the forms of the moral and intellectual life of man. It cannot therefore be limited to a simple function of order and of safeguarding, as was contended by liberalism. It is not a simple mechanism which limits the sphere of the presumed individual liberties. It is an internal form and rule, a discipline of the entire person. It penetrates the will as well as the intelligence. Its principle, a central inspiration of the living human personality in the civil community, descends into the depths and settles in the heart of the man of action, as well as the thinker, of the artist, as well as of the scientist. Thus he says, fascism would not be understood in many of its manifestations were it not considered in the light of his general view of life, a spiritualist view. So I would like to quote a little more of him, but it may take a little longer. Perhaps I'll read it quickly. To fascism, the world is not this material world which appears on the surface, in which man is an individual separated from all other men, standing by himself and subject to a natural law which instinctively impels him to lead a life of momentary and egoistic pleasure. In fascism, man is an individual who is the nation and the country. He is this by means of a moral law which embraces and binds together individuals and generations and an established tradition and mission. A moral law which suppresses the instinct to lead a life confined to a brief cycle of pleasure in order instead to replace it within the orbit of duty in a superior conception of life, free from the limits of time and space, a life in which the individual, by self-abnegation and by the sacrifice of his particular interests, even by death, realizes the entirely spiritual existence in which his value as a man consists. For the fascist views on the formation of an elite or aristocracy in a modern state, we may rely on the views of the other Italian thinker, Evola, whose commentaries on fascist Italy and National Socialist Germany contain invaluable counsels on statecraft. Though Evola criticized Gentile for what he considered to be the moralist aspect of Gentile's state, both thinkers placed an equal emphasis on the transcendental dimension of the state. Evola notes this aspect, especially in the fascist conception of the state, rather than in the National Socialist one. And I quote him, "In fascist political doctrine, the state was recognized as possessing preeminence in respect to people and nation, that is, the dignity of a single superior power through which the nation acquires a real self-awareness, possesses a form and a will, and participates in a supernatural order. As Gentile had stated, nation does not beget the state, according to the decrepit nationalistic concept, which was used as a basis for the publicists of the national states in the 19th century. On the contrary, the nation is created by the state, which gives the people, conscious of their own moral unity, the will, and thereby an effective existence." In National Socialist Germany, on the other hand, the racial nation took precedence over the state, which had in fact been represented earlier by the Prussian state of the Hohenzollern. And I quote, "Prussia had been the creation of a dynasty that had the nobility, the army, and the higher bureaucracy for its backbone." Sorry. The primary element was not the nation or the folk, rather the state, more than the land or the nation, constitute the real foundation and unifying principle. There was none of that in Hitlerism, at least in the area of general political ideology. The state conceived as a secondary and instrumental reality, while the primary formative, moving and bearing force was supposed to be the folk, with the Führer as its representative and incarnation. A merely populist state is in fact a counterfeit version of the fascist state, since it is a mass state characterized by, and I quote, "collectivizing and demagogic movements with an excitable and sub-rational foundation, which can also give to the individual the illusory, momentary sensation of an exalted, intense life, likewise conditioned by sensation, by a regression, and by a reduction of personality and true liberty." So, not having a very strong notion of the state, the Third Reich was also incapable of establishing a supranational state structure, such as the Habsburg Empire preeminently had done. The National Socialist slogan of Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer was perhaps adequate for pan-Germanic aims, but not for a pan-European one. This inadequacy was especially compounded by the doctrines of Nordic supremacy that made enemies of fellow European nations, such as the Poles, most notably, that could have been turned instead into allies against the communist state. That the state is distinct from the nation and the Gemeinschaft does not mean that it is identical to the Gesellschaft or society either. In fact, Evola clearly identifies the societal focus of liberal political theory as its greatest defect. And I quote, "In reality, there is a fundamental antithesis of doctrine between political systems that focus on the idea of the state and those that focus on the idea of society. The second type of system includes the varieties of theories based upon the concept of natural rights, contract theory with a utilitarian base, and democracy with the related developments that stretch from liberal democracy to the so-called people's democracies, that is, Marxist and communist ones. A fascist state, on the other hand, is concerned with the transcendence that can be achieved only through heroic or military virtues such as honor and loyalty that are not only beyond hedonistic values but also beyond eudaimonistic ones, that is, including spiritual well-being." Evola goes on to add that if it is not possible to ask everyone to follow an ascetic and military vision of life, it will be possible to aim at a climate of concentrated intensity of personal life that will encourage people to prefer a greater margin of liberty as opposed to comfort and prosperity. The fascist state, as an organic rather than a mechanical creation, is centralized but not totalitarian and allows individual liberty except when it is necessary to rein in a shapeless and atomistic mass of individuals and wills. In a fascist state, which is directed against both capitalism and communism, the center will be constituted of a principle of authority and a transcendent symbol of sovereignty. The most natural incarnation of such a symbol is the monarchy. However, and I quote him again, "Monarchy is not incompatible with a legal dictatorship, more or less as it was in ancient Rome. The sovereign can confer exceptional unitary powers on a person of special stature and qualifications, still on a legal basis when there are special situations to overcome or exceptional tasks to confront. Thus, when lacking an effective monarch, a state can substitute a dictator, whoever, however, acts by the legitimate and pre-existing system of order, essentially destined to integrate it in case of necessity, in order to consolidate a particular concentration and activation of existing forces. This leader, too, cannot be a modern man of the people, as in the case of National Socialism or communism, or in the present American presidential system, where, I quote, "people only put up with a leader who is essentially one of us, who is one of the people, who expresses the will of the people, who is a good friend." The democratic system of endlessly fluctuating party politics is to be firmly rejected, even though the parliamentary framework may be retained, albeit in a higher aristocratic form. That is, the upper parliamentary house, or the House of Lords in England, should serve as the essential government of the nation and be constituted of an elite that corresponds to the ancient Indo-European offices of the priest and the warrior. This elite, and I quote, "by inserting itself into the normal and essential hierarchies of the state and eventually controlling it, bears to an eminent degree the idea of the state. In this last case, more than a party, it will be appropriate to speak of a kind of order. This is the same function that in other times was exercised by the nobility as a political class. Though representing the nobility in the modern world, the elite occupying the upper house of parliament will also act as the guardians of the idea of the state and will prevent the Caesarean isolation of whoever exercises the supreme authority. The lower House of Parliament should be constituted not of parties that have gained entrance to the weight of popular votes, but of corporate bodies, including the several economic ones, which are all characterized by their function and dignity. Just as the upper house will serve as an advisory council to the king or president, the lower house will work in coordination with the ministers and the prime minister. The task of the upper house is first of all to establish its control over the economic powers of the land that are vested primarily in the middle class. And I quote him, "The sphere of politics and power should be by its very nature and function free from economic influences by economic groups or special interests." It is appropriate to recall the statement of Sulla, who says that his ambition was not to possess gold, but to hold power over those who possess it. This hierarchical constitution of the parliament will preclude the domination of the interests of the lower orders, including the bourgeois ones. As Imola points out, a fascist state should take care, and I quote, on the one hand to eliminate the proletarian and Marxist influences on the worker, and on the other to destroy the purely capitalist mentality of the entrepreneur. In general, what Imola desires is a total reformation of industrial society in a heroic literary fashion. And I quote, against the Marxist and materialist mentality, the same type of military attitude, in the general sense, of which we have spoken earlier, could be made equally effective on the level of work and production. The urgent task of restoring the primacy of politics over economics can be achieved through strictly controlling the monstrous development of capitalism in the direction of unfettered productivity, so that, and I quote, it is limited with the ultimate end of restoring the economy and everything that is economic to the subordinate position in which it becomes only a means to an end and a circumscribed dominion within a much vaster hierarchy of values and interests. Industry's craving for unlimited change should be reined in by the state so as to allow, and I quote, progress or movement in a vertical direction for the realization of higher possibilities and the true autonomy of the person. The aim of the fascist state should indeed be the Stoic ideal of autarky, or, and I quote, an ethics of independence or the sovereignty of the individual. In order to guard this value, where it was necessary, one had to follow the strict principle of abstine et sustine. The national economy, too, should be marked by austerity, in the sense of, if necessary, holding the general standard of living relatively low, adopting what the English call austerity, which even in a different context has had to be practiced here and there by different nations after the Second World War, but assuring ourselves a maximum of independence. Thus, as regards the life of the nation in general, he says, we hold the normal situation to be the complete opposite of everything we are witnessing today. Apparently generalized prosperity and thoughtless living from day to day beyond one's means, along with a frightening state debt balance, leading to extreme economic and social instability, growing inflation, and an invasion of foreign capital, which brings with it many important visible and invisible influences. Only a state pitched at the level of spiritual transcendence can foster the development of personality and true liberty in the sense of virtus, according to the classical understanding. As Evola explains, and I quote, in truth, personality and liberty can be conceived only on the basis of the individual's freeing himself to a certain degree from the naturalness, biological, and primitively individualist bonds that characterize the pre-state and pre-political forms directed in a purely social, utilitarian and contractual sense. In all these fascist conceptions of history and of the philosophical significance of the state, we see thus the diametrical opposite of the liberal American view of life. They further provide a powerful corrective to the historiographical errors of Hegelians like Fukuyama, who raised the political status quo to an ideal, often superficially surveying the external changes of a state, as also to the errors of the Marxists, who conjure up utopias from these same changes. All of these thinkers ignore the transcendent or divine aspect of statecraft, which, as we have observed in our initial survey of ancient Indian and Greek philosophy, also provides the true basis of the necessary hierarchical organization of society. The state should ever bear in mind the constitution of the psyche or soul itself, and aim through a sacred kingship or an enlightened aristocracy or elite at the psychological improvement of the individuals that comprise the state. Materialistic societies governed by economically oriented political doctrines, whether Puritan, Marxist or capitalist, are incapable of any real historical development, because the spiritual element of man, which alone is capable of movement and development, is not best tended by either the middle or the lower classes, or only by an upper class constituted of what the British aptly called the lords spiritual and temporal. Fukuyama's historiographic thesis is thus merely a description of the abortive state of America itself, which has through its history gradually substituted materialistic and economic principles of statecraft for the spiritual ones that originally governed all European monarchies, including the British. The current acceleration of these principles through technological advances by American entrepreneurs like Bill Gates and Elon Musk towards the communist utopia of global governance and surveillance is indeed the final confirmation of the lifeless and vampiristic condition of American society and culture. In considering this American problem, we have noted the fateful role that the Jewish bourgeoisie have played in the history of the West. For the re-entry of the Jews in England during the Puritan Revolution is psychologically linked to the capitalist career of the new American state, as well as to its inevitable transformation into a bourgeois oligarchy. Indeed, all modern political theories that aim at a diminution or dissolution of the state or of the leading religious institution of a nation, whether these theories are called libertarian or populist or anarchist, may be recognized as derivatives of the defective Jewish economic mentality, which is also responsible for the social degeneration generally associated with modernism. This mentality can and should be fully replaced by genuinely Indo-European political doctrines that are not enunciated by the bourgeoisie in the name of the people, but by the non-mercantile aristocratic section of the population that alone can serve as the leaders of a cultured state. Indeed, the primary task of the political constitution should be the preservation of the spiritual eminence of the highest political bodies of the state, as well as of those strata of the population that they represent. Further, the alliance of both the state and its leading religious institution, in the West case the Church, must be consolidated and their role strengthened through the upper house of the Parliament. The current parliamentary structure of government should be reorganized so that the economic concerns of the lower house and of the Prime Minister's cabinet are dominated by the more aristocratic ones of an upper house dedicated to the elevation of the idea of the state and its people. This can be effected only through a strict exclusion of all anti-statist technocratic elements concentrated now among the Jewish oligarchies and bourgeoisie from the higher echelon of government and society. The philosophical guidelines for the regeneration of nations are already to be found in the long tradition of European conservative philosophy that I have surveyed, and that come to sharp focus in the fascist doctrines of Gentile and Evola. Of course, fascism, which is lazily conflated with National Socialism, has today become a term that is abhorrent to those who blindly followed Judaized America in its various utopian adventures. But it is well to remember that the price of American utopianism is the end of history. Thank you.
We are going to make a break and then we'll continue in Greek. I'll give you some assistant to give you some general orientation of what's going on.
Right.
And, but I like to say it's very interesting that you have just made such a contraposition between a fascist and national socialist approach to the issue of state. And I like to say that I consider myself as being a combination of the two on that issue, because I think on the one hand one cannot consider that race, people of a certain race automatically ensures that a true state will be established. That would be too naive. On the other hand, I consider it to be to some extent a necessary presupposition. There has to be a degree of homogeneity, at least on the level of several castes, as it was in ancient India and other ancient Aryan societies, in the sense of the term Aryan. I feel also that actually in National Socialist Germany, when I'm seeing some scenes there is so much ceremonial in that although they in theory maybe have been certainly claiming what you presented to us, but in reality their approach was also one with very distinct transcendent elements in practice. And on the other hand, I'm not sure that the fascist theory, which is more an Evollian theory, an Evollian approach, rather than the actual political approach of the fascist practice in history, Italy's history. I'm missing that true realization of those concepts, although I revere those concepts very deeply. What is your opinion of that?
Right. Actually, the criticism of national socialism that was made by Ebola is valid theoretically, but the Germans insisted on their supremacy because they pointed to their history and said, we are the people who provided all the kings and queens of Europe. They're all Nordic in origin, and we established the states, even though they were only continuing the Roman Empire through the Holy Roman Empire and so on and so forth. But they maintained it well for a long time, and so by the time Hitler came to power, he could point to the past and say, we predominate and we should be allowed to predominate. Only we have that tradition and the potential to control all of Europe. And that is why they had a certain justification. And a further justification that they had, which the Italians did not have, is that they saw this difference that I have pointed to between the Indo-European and the Jewish mentality, and they started their government by separating
they saw it more distinctly than the fascist regime did.
Yeah, the fascist, just theoretical.
Yes, exactly.
So the National Socialists proved to be stronger in their performance.
Yes, actually, when you are talking of the fascist approach, it's one would rather say the Evollian approach, or one might also say true fascist approach, but not the historic fascist approach as we know it through the actions.
Mussolini was, of course, a friend of Gentile's, and they wrote something together. Yes. And Gentile is a very, very remarkable philosopher and worth reading. He should be translated more often into many different languages. Unfortunately, he's not. Ebola is, but not Gentile. So, the fascists have more theoretical works and so on. But the Germans had, the strength in themselves to fight the communists, the Weimar Republic, and establish a state that is the opposite of it. So they did more work, the National Socialists, in countering the communists and the Jews and so on. The Italians, were theoretically very, very sharp, but they didn't see all of the aspects of this political philosophy, I think, that the National Socialist.
Yeah. I think also that Germany in total represented a spiritual line in contrast to the French, in the Latin approach. And one can see that also in Thomas Mann's book before he changed into being a democratic charlatan in order to be accepted by the system. When he wrote what's the title? Eines unpolitischen, Betrachtungen eines unpolitischen, exactly. Where he describes this dichotomy between these two worlds. And I think it's
the closest phenomenon to the Hitlerian is actually the Putin one that is happening now.
Yes.
Because only he shows the same vigor, the same desire to restore the state to its original form and to redefine its boundaries and so on, that Hitler also did. So it's possible even today. I mean, it's happening now.
I wouldn't dare elevate Putin so high, but one must admit that maybe he's the only politician today. All the others are. I think I'm not a fan of him in many senses, and I think he makes very heavy mistakes. But he's the only one who has a true political line. One might criticize that, but he has some political line in.
And he also has the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
He's in a strong position, I think.
Yes.
Παρακαλώ. Ήθελα επειδή μιλάτε για αυτό ακριβώς το θέμα του ήθελα να ρωτήσω αυτή την ακτινογραφία του Αμερικανικού κράτους που μας έκανε ο καθηγητής, πώς την βλέπει σε σχέση με τη Ρωσία σήμερα? Δηλαδή το ρωσικό κράτος σήμερα, η ρωσική συνομοσπονδία, πώς...
How would you relate this review of the American state? I do not dare say American nation because there is nothing like that. And I recently presented in my last YouTube issue. I presented the meaning of a Jew of Hannah Arendt in her interview to French television, where she says something very true, that there is nothing like an American nation. It's not a nation, it has never been a nation. But how would you compare that review of American mentality and history to the Russian reality? Maybe Russian reality is not something final, is something which is molded currently. What's your opinion, your view on that?
Well, I mean, first of all, Russians are Russians, they're not Americans. The people are different. I started my career teaching English in Moscow. I was there for 1.5 years. And it's very clear that it's a different country with a different tradition. All the buildings look different, their customs are different, and the people and their behavior are all different. So Europeans are not the same as Americans. There is something called white nationalism or something, which is spread by some Americans because they think they can, have an American European kind of right-wing conservatism or something. I think it's useless because the Americans are not at all like Europeans. They're completely different. They have a different upbringing, childhood, the way they speak and the way they think and the music they listen to.
Yes,
is
exactly.
also alien. So, first of all, that is the Russian reality. They are Europeans. They are not Americans. And there is no comparison. As I said, Russians are Russians.
Λέει ότι οι Ευρωπαϊκοί, δεν ξέρω, ίσως κάποιοι από εσάς δεν καταλαβαίνουν πλήρως, ότι πρόκειται για δύο τελείως διαφορετικές περιπτώσεις. Στην Αμερική υπάρχει ένα σχίσμα μεταξύ των λευκών Αμερικανών και των λοιπών, αλλά εν τούτης και οι λευκοί Αμερικανοί δεν είναι ακριβώς όπως τα παλιά ευρωπαϊκά έθνη. Ενώ η Ρωσία έχει τα ευρωπαϊκά χαρακτηριστικά, τα ευρωπαϊκά βασικά χαρακτηριστικά. Τουλάχιστον το μέρος της Ρωσίας που ενδιαφέρει εμάς, το λευκό μέρος της Ρωσίας, διότι γνωρίζουμε ότι η Ρωσία, προερχομένη και από την Σοβιετική Ένωση κατά κάποιον τρόπο, ή άκουσα αυτή την κληρονομιά, ίσως και ακόμη παλαιότερα, βεβαρημένη από κάτι ανάλογο, έχει και κάποια ασιατική, ας πούμε, πρόσμιξη, αλλά υπάρχει στο ευρωπαϊκό, το λευκό κομμάτι.
Well, and another thing is they've had a long experience of communism, and communism was only for the political party, the Communist Party. Only they benefit from it. All the people were on the streets. Even now, if you, at least when I was there 15 years ago, most of the people did not go to restaurants and so on because it was too expensive for them. And they would, drink vodka outside on the street or have their sandwiches at little kiosks at the corner of the street and so on. So they are used to austerity. They are completely different kind of creature. They are not like the Americans. Americans have been spoiled, and so the attitudes are completely different. So the Russians again have that advantage of discipline through all the years of suffering that they have.
Yeah. Ναι, οι Ρώσοι είναι ένας πειθαρχημένος λαός και ακόμα και τώρα μετά την κομμουνιστική περίοδο είναι μαθημένοι, δεν έχουν ποτέ θυστεί σε μια κοινωνία αυθονίας και είναι μαθημένοι σε μια ζωή λιτότητος κτλ. Και όλοι γνωρίζουμε ότι η αυθονία και η απεριστιψία διαφθείρει. Είτε πραγματική αυθονία, είτε όπως ήταν στην Αμερική, είτε εικονική αυθονία, όπως παροιμήν, έτσι. Που κάποτε πίστεψε ο κόσμος αυτά που ήθελε να τον παραμυθιάσει η άρχουσα πολιτική μειονότηση των απατεώνων και προδοτών, πως τάχα είναι πλούσια, ας πούμε, επειδή κάποιοι δείκτες του χρηματιστηρίου ανέβαιναν πλασματικά. Ναι. Well, let's finish here. We shall make a break, and then we'll continue a little. We don't have so much time, so thank you very much. Please give a hand.